pleasant good day to all of our viewers. Welcome to another edition of Marriage Encounter. We're delighted to be with you on the airways, and those of you who are joining via the World Wide Web, we welcome you just the same. We have been having a very important discussion on values. We are talking about boundaries. We have come to discuss values. And we said that values are the bedrock, the foundation stone on which you build your relationship. We are going to move on to talk about, I think, a value or a set of values that means everything to marriage. Dr. Braithwaite, today's discussion, I believe, is going to be just as important as any we have had.
Yes.
And I believe those folks who are maybe having some challenges in their relationships need to pay special attention to our discussion for today.
Yes. Great to be with you again. Hope that you're all doing very well and that your relationships are thriving and moving forward. And just looking forward to enter this new into discussion, on this new value that we're going to be talking about. We've had some very engaging discussions, Doc, and a number of persons have shared with me how much they are enjoying this particular discussion on values and on boundaries to a large extent, how meaningful it has been to help them to decipher some of the feelings that they've been having in areas where they've been challenged. So, really, really exciting, and again, looking forward to what we'll do today.
Well, let's begin with a word of prayer, shall we? Father, be with us as we share with our friends. We ask for your wisdom and your guidance. Grant that the information we provide will prove meaningful. We are discussing a very important set of values today, and we pray that you will give understanding to those who listen. In Jesus' name,
amen.
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 Well, last week we were ending our discussion on faithfulness, and I believe everybody would agree that that is an essential in any marriage relationship.
Yes, it is.
But we're going to go into something that is also very essential. In fact, we're moving on to talk about some values that help to solidify, to build, to strengthen the other values that we have spoken about before.
Yeah.
And today we want to talk about what we're going to call compassion and forgiveness.
Right.
Those words, compassion and forgiveness, are two very important words in a marriage relationship, Dr. Braithwaite.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we're talking about values. They're foundational, really, to the success of any relationship. And maybe something that we don't talk about enough as it relates to relationships and the real ebb and flow of a relationship, the moments of the highs and the moments of the lows. That's what when I refer to the ebb and flow, because the reality is that in relationships you're going to have great moments, you're going to have challenging moments. And how do you operate during times of difficulty? What are your views on expressing compassion even when you've been hurt? Or how do you understand the whole notion of forgiveness? So I think, it's going to be a very important discussion.
It is. Now, if I take our viewers back to, for those of you who are married, and may I say for those of you who are in love, you're maybe not married yet, but maybe you're courting, maybe you have your wedding date set. And for those of you who are already married, you can reflect back on when you first saw your spouse, when you were trying to get him or her. At that moment when you felt so enamored by the love from your partner. And you think of your partner as charming, as kind, as attractive, all those nice things, and you sometimes can't go to sleep without sending a note. Now, if you're very old, you may have had to telephone or write a letter or something to that effect. But these days we have instant messaging.
Instant messaging, video calling.
And so you think of all those nice things about your spouse. And we want to say, in spite of all of that your spouse is not perfect. Right? In fact, your spouse has some serious flaws. Is it safe to say that? Somebody may be offended by that statement.
It's a reality. And I think, that is one of the things that we probably need to help people to understand a little more, because again, when you look at people who get who come together, get engaged, you know, there is a tendency for people to diminish the reality of challenges in the relationship because they want the relationship to do well. In quotes, they want it to do well. You know, there is a scale that we use when we're doing premarital counseling, Doc, which is called the idealistic distortion. And the idealistic distortion suggests when a person is in a relationship, to what extent that person attempts to skew or to bias the relationship positively, meaning that there are problems or there may be challenges, but they are ignoring those challenges because they want the relationship to look good. And, you know, to that extent, it is really, really critical, you know, in our discussion for persons to realize that, hey, you see that perfect guy or that perfect girl that you've been talking to, perfect in quotes, they have some real challenges.
Some real challenges.
Some real challenges.
That's the reality. And I think if we can appreciate that fact, it would help us to not be so surprised by some failures.
Right.
Because the truth is, your spouse will do some bad things. Your spouse will fail you.
Yep.
Now, that does not sound very kind, Dr. Bradley. Your spouse will fail you. I can hear somebody saying, my spouse will what? But the reality is, as some of you may have already discovered, as loving and as charming as your spouse is not an angel.
Right.
And there are things about your spouse that will upset you, that you will not like. Your spouse came to the relationship perhaps with some character flaws that are not easy to go away. Maybe you did see some of it in courting and you told yourself that after marriage you're going to handle that, and you discover that, hey, every time I try to address this issue, it seems to get a little deeper.
Yep.
So now, where does all of this fit with what we're talking about? Compassion and forgiveness.
Well, I just, before we move there, Doc, I really want to drive home the point, right? You know, and not only will you be disappointed from time to time, but your spouse will hurt you at some points and will actually fail you at some points. You know, that's the reality of the matter. It's one of those things that you don't relish, but it's real. You know, there is one author, an author team, I believe, the surnames were black, but they highlighted the fact that it is often the people who are closest to you who can hurt you the most.
That's so true.
So because your spouse knows you intimately, they know your realities, your fears, your joys, and in moments of hurt and pain, you know, your spouse may be tempted to and may actually yield to that temptation to use something that they know will hurt you against you. You know, and it's not a nice thought, but it's a reality that can actually happen. And so the hurt and the pain would be deep because the reality is you never would have anticipated that your spouse would do something like that to you.
And let's get this right. Sometimes the hurt is not intentional.
Correct, yeah.
You know, but the fact that your spouse is not perfect means that they are capable and are likely to fall below your expectations. And you may not have anticipated that, and it may create some challenges. And you may say things like, I am disappointed, I am deeply hurt, I did not expect this. That's what happens when we live with an imperfect person. But bear in mind that you are also imperfect. Right? That's important.
Absolutely. Yeah. The wise man Solomon says, Ecclesiastes 7:20, there is not a righteous man on earth who does what is right and never sins. And I think, you know, that encapsulates, there's not a righteous man, there's not a righteous woman, there's no righteous person who does everything right all the time. So in your beautiful marriage, anticipate that there will be challenges.
So we all have imperfect spouses.
Correct.
And imperfect people do imperfect things.
That's correct.
From time to time, we are going to be disappointed by the actions or non-actions of our spouses.
Absolutely.
So the question is, what then? What do we do when our spouse fails us?
Yeah.
Do we quit?
Yep. Right.
some people do.
Well, yeah, I suspect that's the reason why we have rates of divorce that are as high as they are. Because I think that when people end up recognizing the failures, and I've heard people say, I didn't get married for this, you know. You know what I mean? It's like the challenges are so great that you just feel like, I've got to give up, I've got to change. This is not what I signed up for. And so, it is that reality. When the person recognizes these flaws, these character failings, and so on and so forth, for many people, the answer is just give up.
And we are suggesting that you don't have to take that route. There is hope. And that is why what we're talking about today, this discussion about compassion and forgiveness, is so significant. I don't know how far we're going to get into it today. We are laying the foundation now. And we are starting by suggesting that the fact that you have an imperfect spouse, and you said you want to rub it in, and
right.
It has to be rubbed in. Your spouse is not perfect. Sometimes I hear people introducing their spouse or making reference to their spouse in a speech or something, and they say, I have the best spouse in the world, and that kind of thing. And we all do that,
yes.
and that's good to be positive and to give praise and recognition to our spouses. But we have to tell ourselves from time to time, your spouse is not perfect. That's the reality. So there is something that I want to highlight here, Doc. You just read from, is it Ecclesiastes 7, I believe?
Yes.
And verse 20?
Yes.
There's not a righteous man, not a perfect man on the earth. But there is something that I want to share with us too. And this is what this says. Just a setup. When you discover that your spouse is not perfect, or that your spouse has failed you, as we say, you can quit.
Right. You have some choices, right?
You have a few choices.
Yeah.
But quitting is not the best option.
Okay.
So permit me to say, Doc, or to quote from Cloud and Towson, nothing in a relationship has to permanently destroy that relationship if forgiveness is in the picture. I wanted to highlight that because I think that is a powerful statement. So I'm going to say it again. 1 Peter 4:8 says, love covers a multitude of sins.
Yes.
And now I'm saying that nothing in a relationship has to permanently destroy that relationship when there is forgiveness.
That's right.
So when your spouse does not measure up, does not live up to your expectations, there is forgiveness.
Yeah.
Well, somebody is saying, how often?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of the realities of our experience, Doc. We could also say that there's no hurt that cannot be healed, really. But, that would come from a certain maturity in the experience of the individuals who are involved in the relationship. And, it's an age-old question about how long do you forgive? How long do you receive hurt? We're talking about boundaries. We've spoken about the ability to be assertive, to say what you want, and to set certain guidelines as you attempt to protect, your property, so to speak, yourself. So we have to create that balance, as well as understand that when we speak about forgiveness as Christian family life educators, Doc, we often refer back to God's love for us, and how often does He forgive us? I think that kind of grounds us in relationship to the whole issue of forgiveness.
And it's interesting because, as we introduce this subject of compassion and forgiveness, we are suggesting that it's attitudinal.
Yes.
You have to adopt the mindset. Now, if I'm driving a vehicle and I know that it's an old vehicle, that it's giving problems, if I start out saying I can expect certain things to happen, when the vehicle breaks down, I don't have to curse the vehicle.
Right.
I anticipated that something would not go right. If I tell myself it's a perfect vehicle and it breaks down, it makes life a little more difficult for me.
You set up yourself.
So attitude is important.
Yes.
We have to expect along the way some bumps. Since I'm talking about driving, if you're from Antigua, you would be familiar with potholes. Maybe I should say that. But we have to expect some potholes along the road, along the journey. Yeah. And it helps to, not that you are looking for failures, but if something happens in your relationship, it's better for you to know that my spouse is not perfect. So what do? Do I quit? No. We're saying, don't quit. We're not suggesting that you should not be hurt, and we're not suggesting that you should not be disappointed. But what we're saying is, what do you do? If you're in a situation, it makes sense to exercise compassion.
Right. Right. I was just going to say, in the field, in our field of family life education, we talk about being realistic, or we speak about managing expectations, right? In the context of being aware that, your spouse can make mistakes. If you go into the relationship thinking that, your spouse is going to be perfect, they're not going to ever do anything that will be wrong or will hurt you, it means that your expectations are probably a bit too high. It means that your expectations are not managed properly. And so we're suggesting that it's important to manage those expectations. Just as you will have failings, you have to make room for the fact that your spouse will also have failings. And as you mentioned earlier, we're not perfect. So as we take the journey, you have to have the awareness that, those mistakes will be made. And you also want to sort of prep yourself for, your attitude to forgiveness, your attitude to compassion, whenever you are placed in that arena where you have to express, where you have to express forgiveness and you have to express compassion. You have a mindset, an attitude that says, I am willing to do that.
It would be well for us to also remember that we ourselves are not perfect. And some people may think that they will never make a mistake in their marriage. That person does not exist. You sometimes, I heard a preacher one Sunday morning, I turned on the television many years ago, and I don't remember the name of the preacher. This is not my story, it's something I'm reflecting. But I heard a preacher saying, Doc, that there was this anniversary celebration of a couple. They were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and the man said, we never had an argument. Never had a disagreement in the 50 years we got married. And the wife wanted to know what in now somebody listening, a young married couple was there, and the man was saying, wow, I need to go talk to this man. I need to learn the secret, because I've had so many ups and downs in my relationship. So he went to the gentleman afterwards and he said, what's your secret? And the gentleman shared the story. The gentleman said, in those days when we got married, one of the popular means of brides and grooms moving from the church is what you call a horse-drawn carriage.
Yes.
And he said they chose to use a horse belonging to his wife, now his wife, and the horse's name was Betsy. And as they got in the carriage and the horse started going down the road, Betsy stopped, and the wife said, Betsy, this is the first warning. Move along. Betsy went on again. And Betsy stopped a second time, and the wife came out of the carriage, pulled out a pistol, and shot Betsy. and the husband, the young husband, was shocked by his wife's action. And he turned to her and he said, honey, that's real cruel. Just for one mistake? And the wife looked at him and said, honey, this is the first one. And he said he made sure there was never a number two.
He wasn't going to survive. He wouldn't have survived number two.
He would not have survived number two. So it's kind of like he operated under duress for the rest of his marriage.
Right,
but you don't want a situation like that. No, sir. You want to be free.
Yes.
And so you are going to have differences of opinion. You're going to have some challenges here and there. That's just the reality. You are not perfect.
Yeah.
If ever you adopt the attitude that you're perfect, you will never do anything wrong in the relationship, all of the faults in the relationship are as a result of your spouse, you need to do some introspection.
Yeah.
You need to be checked out.
Yeah. As we proceed, the whole notion of acknowledging, and then when there are mistakes made, Doc, you can express, that first point that we've been talking about, which is compassion, that ability to be compassionate. There has to be a certain tender-heartedness about the individual, about the spouse, to be able to express that compassion. Truth is, some people can be very hard. And when I say hard, I mean unforgiving, lacking compassion, because sometimes in their own mind they don't make mistakes. But beyond that also, we also have to consider, and we do some of this in premarital counseling, we have to consider our childhood experiences. Why might it be that one individual in the relationship sort of lacks that compassion? And while we talk about compassion, I want to, I really particularly like how Cloud and Townsend relate to it based on the Strong's Hebrew and Greek dictionary. And it says, the Bible describes God's compassion as to bend or stoop in kindness to an inferior. And I really, I think that is so powerful, because compassion sort of, based on this explanation, sort of levels the playing field. In the world today, in our society today, a lot of people feel like one person is superior and one is superior. Obviously, the marriage covenant that God has established does not issue that at all. Speaks about the what you might consider to be the fact that husband and wife are equal. But at the same time, it's important for us to appreciate that even if a person is to feel as though they were superior, compassion allows us to bend or to stoop in kindness to another individual who you may consider to be inferior. Of course, in your marriage, your wife or your husband is not inferior, but it's that ability to enter into, that ability to stoop, that ability to bend, that ability to allow yourself to understand what the other person is going through and to be able to empathize with them, so much so that you can enter into what their experience is, and then, out of a heart of love and compassion, extend, what we'll discuss about further, forgiveness.
It sends me back to the experience of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Because when Adam and Eve sinned, when they disobeyed God, when we look at God's attitude towards them, now, when you consider, I'm going back to the concept you shared there about compassion, meaning bending from a position of superiority to an inferior. You willingly deciding that you're going to step down to meet the other person at their level. When Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, God did not have to bother with them. He could have written them off.
Right.
But what God did instead is that he went searching for them. Now, God is perfect. God is holy. God is sinless. But here is a perfect God going in search of somebody who is obviously in a state of failure. And that's the idea. God extending his compassion, his love, when an individual is clearly not in the right. And if perchance your spouse does something that is wrong, I can use an example that we use often on this program, Doc. If your spouse, rather than paying the bill, use the money to do something else, maybe lent a friend the money, and you realize now that your electricity gets disconnected, or you have to reallocate some other finances that you had for some other purpose to solving this issue. One spouse can become very angry and irate about the situation, but there is a failure. Right now, how do you relate to that failure? Do I decide, if that's the kind of man you are, that's the kind of woman you are, I have nothing to do with you for the rest of your life, get out, go, or do I exercise compassion? Do I step down? I am a perfect money manager, I would never do a thing like that. Do I step down and meet you where you are, and exercise compassion? Not saying you are right with what you did, but reaching out. What happened? Why didn't you share with me? I love you. What's going on here? that kind of attitude makes a big difference in a marriage.
It sure does. When we think about marriages, when we think about standards, for example, in the context of the marriage, we generally would have an idea of what the ideal standard is. You know, and in context of that ideal standard, oftentimes, you know, the reality is that what we often are faced with is what we may consider to be something that is inferior to the ideal standard. All right, so this is a standard, and the person functions in a way that is less than the ideal. If you operate as though you know the ideal standard and you always maintain the ideal, then, you know, you come across sometimes as being a bit, you know, puffed up, if you want to put it that way. But your ability now to recognize that even though there's an ideal standard and the person may have fallen below the ideal standard, your ability to recognize that and to encourage the person rather than sort of try to beat them over their head with a big stick because you are so-called you know, I am the ideal and I always maintain the ideal. When you can recognize with your spouse that, hey, look, the ideal wasn't met on this occasion, but we can continue to work towards the ideal as a unit, as a couple, then it provides encouragement and it allows the person to recognize that you are not so puffed up and you're not so, you know, you don't have such an attitude of being it all, that you can actually dialogue and work with your spouse to be at a better place, understanding that you could be in the very same position in a very short time.
Well, but definitely, and I think that is also very important, because if you assume the posture that, you know, you're so superior,
yeah,
you would never do a thing like that. We have to remember that we ourselves are not perfect,
yeah.
And I don't suppose that people plan to fail. You know, people don't plan to fail. I don't think people genuinely want to disappoint their spouse. Even partners who go out and are unfaithful, when you interview them, you sense that there is some element of remorse. You know, they're sorry that they brought hurt to their spouse. Right. So having the awareness that you yourself isn't perfect,
yeah,
should help you in your attitude towards somebody who has done something wrong.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Very important. And, you know, I think, you know, as we go along, this discussion is going to sort of morph and get more and more interesting because I think it's an area that a lot of people may have some challenges with. I think there are some very important things that we have to share, Doc, as we relate to this reality. And so looking forward to
most definitely.
Next session.
We're going to have to stay here for today.
Yeah.
But if you do have questions, comments, or concerns, Marriage Encounter at slcadventist.org. That address again, Marriage Encounter at slcadventist.org. That's all the time we have for today. We look forward to continuing this very intriguing discussion next week. Until then, may God bless you.